Good afternoon, everyone. Sorry to interrupt your lunches, but wanted to first introduce myself. My name is Joel Samuels. I'm the director of the Rule of Law Collaborative. It's a pleasure to see everyone here. I want to thank all of our speakers. I want to particularly thank Pam Rodriguez for providing our opening remarks this morning. And I want to welcome you all again, as my colleague Hamid Khan did, to our symposium on alternatives to incarceration. I want to thank you all for being with us through the morning. We look forward to engaged conversation throughout the afternoon as well. It's my pleasure to introduce our lunchtime keynote speaker, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of INL at the Department of State, Jim Walsh. PDAS Walsh will be talking about the role of INL as at the front line of the opioid crisis, connecting, I think he will be, talking about the relationship between the work that INL is doing abroad and domestic issues. And we've seen already throughout our conversation this morning the lessons that can be learned from the United States and our experiences with ATI, but also the unique perspectives and unique contexts of the international settings in which many of us are working. And INL's work, both abroad and as it relates to the domestic space, I think bridges a lot of the conversations that we've been having. And so there was no one better to have here, and we're pleased to have him joining us. So PDAS Walsh, thank you for being here today.
Thank you. All right. Is this thing on? It works. Okay, great. Well, I'm truly honored to be here and actually humbled. I'll start by saying I am not a corrections expert, as you can imagine, working in the State Department. I'm a full-time diplomat, but I do have some experiences working in corrections and alternatives to incarcerations. And it goes all the way back from my first visit to a prison, which was overseas, believe it or not. And I got to see the worst of the worst. My first visit to a prison was in Georgia, not the state, but the country, Tbilisi, Georgia. And this is before they had a lot of their corrections reform. So this is, I'm going back, I'm trying to remember, it was 2005 or 2006. They took us to one of their pretrial jails. And as you can imagine, this is an old Russian Soviet-style building. Didn't have any heat or air. Had just one big, giant community room, about 300 square feet. And they had 200 people in it. And every one of those 200 people, you talk to them, were stuck in pretrial detention, waiting for a trial date. And this is before Georgia had any concept of what the process of pretrial, any alternatives to pretrial alternatives, and they were just stuck there. And some of these people were stuck there for over a year and a half. Imagine living in a 300 square foot room with 200 people. So that was actually I wasn't done there. Then they took me to their high intensity, wait, there's more. They took me, okay, well, that's our pretrial. Now let's go to our corrections, our real prison where we have the really bad guys. And they were really proud of what they had to show me because of how much controls they had over these very dangerous guys. And these were dangerous people. I mean, I'm talking the top of the thieves and laws. And if you're familiar with what's going on with anything in Eastern Europe, the thieves and laws are some of the worst when it comes to some of these gangs and criminal organizations. And so before I go in there, all the corrections officers suit up by putting masks, armor, machine guns, and then I'm walking in there, it's like, well, where's my machine gun if this is this bad? But sure enough, they walk in there and they show me how tight it is to control these guys. And so that's just one example of some of the experiences I had early on. I also had another experience actually in Juba. That was a lot of fun. Don't recommend that as a vacation spot, but they're working on it. Anyways, so that was another example where there was just nothing in these poor countries, where it was just literally walls. There was a few huts where people could sleep, but everybody else just sat in just worked in the community. And one of the saddest things, as you can imagine, is that you have, unfortunately, in a lot of these countries, women go to jail because of, quote unquote, sexual crimes, which isn't their fault at all. And then, let alone, there's their child, because they have no other place to put the child, sitting there in prison, living with her mother. So that was 2007, 2008, and I'm pleased to announce we've really come a long way. So internationally, we have come a long way, and I'm really proud of what INL, our bureau, has done. I would argue in this international space, I don't think there's another country doing more on corrections, prison reform than the United States, and INL in particular. And so we're so proud of that, and I'm so proud of the fact that my organization recognized 15, 20 years ago that if you want to have good, true criminal justice reform, you got to think about all the pillars of the criminal justice system, and prisons is one of those right up there. But we've got a long way to go, ladies and gentlemen. And I'm really excited because we're basically on this next step of where we're going when it comes to corrections development overseas, and especially alternatives to incarceration. And a lot of that is the lessons learned we learned here in the United States. I argue that our role really is to export some of the best practice. One of our roles is to export some of those best practices we have in the United States and to make it better for our partners overseas so we can support our national security interest. And you can imagine the prison population would have 20-some million, right? The overall world population. And we have 2 million of those. We have a lot of opportunities for practice when it comes to prison and alternatives to incarceration. So you guys are very familiar with the reforms that have taken place in the United States. Certainly at a policy level, we had some major reforms that took place with the First Step Act. One of the biggest, I think, are criminal justice reform efforts from Congress in Washington, D.C., and arguably in the last 15, 20 years. And that's a huge step forward. But that's just a piece of that. And as you guys know, we got there because of all the grassroots and practices that the Congress people were learning about taking place in our communities around our country. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of those, and then that's going to tie into kind of how we're going to export some of these things overseas, and how this is really important to what we're doing and how it relates to our national security. And then I'll kind of tie up with some questions because I really want to hear some of your questions. So let me talk about some of these really amazing best practices. You probably heard from somebody this morning already. Where's Pam? Hi, Pam. Nice to see you again. I visited Pam and Task in Chicago last year sometime. When was that, Michelle? Last year sometime. Everything's a blur. And it was a prime example, and you guys heard that this morning, a prime example of how communities have to come together to deal with one of the major problems with our prison populations and dealing with the reform, and that's the drug addiction issues and the substance abuse disorders that we're dealing with in this country. And so part of our policy, and unfortunately it took this opioid crisis that we have going on in the United States to really give us a big wake-up call, to recognize that this has got to be a whole, not only a whole of government, but a whole of nation effort to kind of fix the grassroots problems and going after that. And alternatives to incarcerations, I will tell you, is one of those key components. And so what I learned in Chicago, and I also had some other visits, Pam, not just to Chicago, but I also learned in Ohio, and I also came in Kentucky, some other examples of all these great best practices that are happening around our country, and what's the impact overall of how it's impacting our communities, how it's impacting the individual, and then my role is how do I take that overseas and then support our national security interest. So you guys may have heard some of this. You're going to hear a little bit more about this, but some of these alternatives to incarcerations, especially with the drug abuse issue, is that we've had a lot of years of experience with drug courts. I mean, everybody's heard about the drug courts. They've been out for a while. They've been pretty successful. There's been pockets of success at the prosecutor level, pockets of success with at the sheriff level and the pretrial. But I think what we're doing now is we're bringing it all together. And I think that's one of the things that lessons learned that we're going to apply, is that if you just have your law enforcement over here, you have your community services over here, your health professionals over here, your judges over here, your prosecutors over here, and you don't bring them together. And I think that's one of the great things I learned from Task, is how they're bringing everyone together and regularly meeting with these professionals and sorting through, okay, where are the points of entries that we need to think about when it comes to identifying if this individual, how do we treat the individual? How do we deal with this issue? So that is one of those critical questions that we're asking through a whole of nation kind of aspect. Treating the individual, imagine that. And which is a radical change, I think, than what our policies has been in the past, which is, again, a challenge I think we have to deal with, and I'll talk about this in a second, is dealing with this perception that these alternatives incarcerations actually create a risk for our communities. And that was the one thing I was really asking, and I'm digging more into the data, and the data is starting to show this. But these options actually make our community safer. So just think about this. So we all have heard about the recidivist issues, and then the vicious cycle of someone that gets addicted to drugs, and they have to find the money to support their addiction. And it's just this vicious criminal cycle just continues and continues. But it's not just that individual. Think about the family. There the studies from NIJ that show the evidence of the children of these prisoners that get thrown in there, that they are likely to become susceptible to a criminal activity and other issues, less productive citizens, because their family members are in prison. And so how do we think about those situations? So there's so many layers we need to be thinking of, from not just the individual, but also from our community safety perspective. And so this is where I'm going to emphasize data and statistics, and I encourage all of you, as you guys start thinking about bringing these ideas back there, encouraging the data and the research to follow through. We're going to need that to convince the policymakers, continue to convince the policymakers. I think we have most of the policymakers here in the United States agreeing to this, but they're not all there yet. And I'm here to tell you, internationally, they're definitely not there yet. Because let's face it, there's a lot of risk with this. And I know there's a lot of risk every day for a prosecutor, a judge, a sheriff, to make that hard choice of, okay, do I send this person to get treatment? Or is this guy or a young lady or individual a person that's a true trafficker that is wreaking havoc in our communities? And those professionals have to make tough choices. So figuring those things out, getting those best practices out, are something that we want to do. Lastly, let me talk a little bit about how we're going to deploy this overseas. And Joel mentioned this about some of our programs that we have in INL. We have this phenomenal drug demand reduction program in INL that we've been exporting and promoting overseas. It's to the point where we have this tremendous network that they're sharing these best practices. But we also have the research. We have this research on how we've established universal prevention curriculum, universal treatment curriculum, and this is science-driven. So we're using this to apply to the health professionals. Now our new strategy is what we just talked about. We're going to integrate that with some of our corrections programs. And now that this is the cool thing about the national security imperative. Georgia and South Sudan and those examples I started the conversation with are just the tip of the iceberg of some of the other challenges that many of these countries are facing. And so we have a tremendous vicious cycle, especially in Central America and other places, where it's just a huge recruiting ground for these criminals to join our gangs, join transnational criminal organizations that then turn out to be the traffickers that are sending these drugs here to the United States, are disrupting security and stability around the world. And so this is a critical population we want to focus on. And so what we're learning here, what we've learned in the past, we're going to apply that to some of our corrections reforms, some of our drug demand reduction programs, integrate those, and actually, look at some of those things, not only help the individuals, help those countries, but help our national security interests as well. So that's where we're going. I'm very excited about it, and we couldn't have done that without hearing and learning from all you guys. So I'm very excited to be here. I'm very excited to take some of your questions. I hope you do have some questions. I wanted to kind of keep my conversation topics a little shorter, though. I've been talking about 15 minutes, so I'm right on time. So with that, take it away. Who's got any questions for me? I'd love to answer them. It's always that first person afraid to ask the question every time I do one of these things. All right, thank you, sir. I can't hear you.
A good deal of the efforts of the
You're gonna I'm sorry, sir, you're going to have to start over. I didn't hear anything.
Well, I wanted to just ask a question regarding the narcotics business with the Maduro regime.
Yeah.
According to news reports, they've indicated that a great deal of their activity has been in this area to undermine the United States. They keep talking about the United States being a problem when it appears their country appears to be more of a problem than we can be. All this is somehow secretly being put into containers and then placed in ships and finally arrives here in ports, but a lot of it's been found under the most difficult conditions, breaking up pieces of concrete and finding a center filled with cocaine.
Yeah.
Do you have much to say about this? I don't know whether their government is a narcotics industry, but it surely appears to be part of it. They said that a good deal of drug dealers or cartel leaders are now in charge of the reserves, the reserve armed forces in Venezuela. It looks like a terrible issue. I wondered what your feelings were on this. Is there anything to be done about it? Or will anything be done about it besides sanctions, which appear to be quite effective?
Yeah, good question. I do have a lot to say about that. And in fact, Assistant Secretary Madison and I did say things about that in our recent international meeting in Vienna on the Commissions on Narcotic Drugs, publicly stating our concerns with Venezuela and the fact they're not only not doing their fair share of rules responsibilities when it comes to the treaties, which is ensuring and protecting not only their citizens but international community from drugs, but they're participating in it. And so we agree that what we're seeing is that more and more of the Maduro regime is engaged in the narco trafficking. What do we do about that? What my bureau can do about it, we have to wait till day +1, meaning that there's a lot of other things going on with the sanctions and other things that the President Trump is trying to do to help the people of Venezuela get that opportunity to get democracy back. And we would play a role, just like the lessons learned we have in Colombia and other places, of supporting a new government from Venezuela. Well, President, actually have a new government, we would argue, with President Guaido, but supporting him once they come into power and reforming that.
Thank you very much. My question is, are there possibilities in your experience for implementing alternatives to incarceration for terrorism and violent extremism related cases? Thank you.
Yeah. As a matter of fact, we actually are already partnering up with our Bureau for Counterterrorism and the State Department. And some countries, I won't highlight which ones, but some of the vulnerable countries. And what we discovered is kind of like, I hate to go back to my example in Georgia as an example, but separation of the most violent of violent is a component of good corrections policy, and ensuring and identifying those. And then we have all this great technology where we can now not only identify them, but get their records, all those other things, and track them. And so we are working in some of those places right now. Yes, sir.
Thank you for your remarks, and congratulations your support of Just Track's important work. We heard this morning about the many benefits of successful alternatives to incarceration programs, a reduction in recidivism, reduced pretrial detention, reduction in costs, and just better results for the community. We've also heard about institutional and cultural resistance to imposing alternative to incarceration programs or implementing them. Are there some success stories abroad where INL has worked or the U.S. government has worked where you can describe some of the results in a sort of tangible way?
Yeah, I'll give you two examples. Let me start at the international multilateral area. In 2016, we had this thing called UNGAS, it was the UN, where we discussed drug policy going forward. And in that session, we laid out not a protocol, but a resolution that talked about alternatives to incarceration. That took the 130 plus countries that are signed up to this to agree to that. So there has been some momentum to look at that as and promoting that as a matter of policy. Specifically, I think we made a lot of progress bilaterally in Mexico. It's not only their corrections reform, but working with them to kind of get them up to standards. And correct me if I'm wrong, what were the standards that, APA standards that we used? We looked at them and we went from key prisons to prisons to work on that. But also we then linked those up with the drug courts. And so my trips to Mexico, working with them and working with civil society, they recognize that there's a lot more momentum going there as well. So there's a couple of examples. I think we got a little bit of work to do in some other countries, but we're getting there. All right. 3 questions, Joel. I think that's it. Oh, yes, ma'am.
Hi. So this is kind of a bit more domestic policy issue, but we've heard a lot about individualizing these alternatives to incarceration and making sure that people are met at an individual level. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on how we can implement or write legislation that allows for this individualization, but also a systemic change. That seems to be something that if we're kind of putting this very broad, sweeping overhaul to the system, how can we also allow for very individualized change throughout the states and throughout the systems?
There are some legislative requirements needed. And I'm going to go back to my conversations in Chicago, where they needed the state of Illinois to kind of work on some legislation for their diversionary programs. Just because you think about, as I mentioned, these officials they have to have some sort of criminal justice, criminal procedure code to allow them to do these kinds of things. And so my recommendation is that look at the other states that are doing that. I'm not the expert on what specifically, but there's other states that are out there doing these kind of things and use them as the best examples to apply to, I don't know what state or what country you're talking about. Texas. Yeah, so use this forum right now to find out who's done this, and or talk to these guys at Just Track, and they can point you in the right direction on some of the criminal procedure code that needs to be reformed and adjusted in order to do some of these programs. But it's a good question there. I know there are some requirements, legislative requirements to implement them. You're welcome. Yes, sir.
I'd give you a shout out for
I'll take a shout out.
for INL putting an experienced community corrections administrator, embedding him in Armenia for 2 months.
Yeah.
Taking somebody who has a working knowledge of evidence-based policy and practice, who's done it within jurisdictions in a couple of different states in the United States, who's a very down-to-earth, salty individual, sending him in to roll up his sleeves and work alongside these people to acknowledge the context in which they're taking on a totally new and different experience from what they've known, and to be able to do that over a period of time, to coach them, encourage them, to acknowledge what they can and can't do with the lack of resources that they have, is a far more practical effort than events being dropped on them. So I appreciate INL's making that kind of an investment if you're going to have a strategic long-term impact.
Yeah, thank you for those comments. And I agree that there's only so much policy work that you need to do, and it needs to be done. But that's something I can do. I certainly can't go into that corrections in Armenia, which I have been, and by the way, I was just as impressed. You need those salty experts to go in there and apply those best practices and lesson learns. Yeah, in Armenia, I was really impressed with what was going on in Armenia, especially for a small amount of resources especially what they're doing with the prison population. And we're not talking about alternatives to incarceration, but within the prison itself, there's so much reform that needs to be done. Just the coaching, the mentoring, the counseling that needs to take place. You know, we saw something, you guys watched 60 Minutes the other day. There was a really great episode, and that was, what state was that? Was it Connecticut? It was Connecticut. They were doing those kind of, I never thought, I mean, what a great idea. Just have prisoners be mentors to the young prisoners. And it's working. Imagine that. But thanks. Yeah, it was pretty interesting.
I work at CCAT, Organization for American
Yes,
States.
I think we've met. Yeah, nice to see you.
Met in Vienna recently. I just wanted to say that, in fact, I mean, when you say that you're doing a lot abroad, that we are one of the brokers or the channels through which you do a lot of activities. And in CCAT, under the leadership of Ambassador Nam, we are really very pleased to be implementing, I mean, just helping exporting some of the models, task model and others abroad. It is something that countries are demanding, and we are really thankful. Not a question, just a comment. That it is really
and my comment is, I apologize because my staff wrote into my remarks to give you a shout out, and it's on my 3x5 card. But Joel, I told you we said, oh, nobody would know what I'd missed, but somebody knew what I missed my 3x5 card. Yeah, you guys, we do some great work, and we're looking forward to the presidency here coming up in the next few months here and doing some things with that. Yes, ma'am.
So in some countries in Latin America, there are USAID projects that are working to strengthen the judicial sector. How is your office analyzing the unintended consequences of cutting off USAID to the Northern Triangle countries like El Salvador, Honduras, and which one am I missing? Guatemala?
Yeah. Well, we're still in the review process. So right now, the department, and I don't know if are you with USAID right now? Or
No, with DAI, USAID implementer.
Okay. The State Department and USAID are currently in a review process based on the President's guidance. And so we're just taking a look at what, providing recommendations to the Secretary and to the President and highlighting some of those impacts. So we're going through the hard work of identifying, okay, what does this mean? But I'll go back to some of the comments that Secretary Pompeo made over the weekend. We've given these countries a lot of assistance over the years. And the fact that, you know, using diplomacy, and this is a diplomacy tool that the President and the Secretary are using to highlight that, you know, they should be doing more. So we're going to follow this review process, see where it goes. But I would also argue that we also have a tremendous amount of institutional memory in these countries. So even if there may be a pause coming up here, maybe a short-term, long-term, I don't know. I think that institutional memory will continue and that there'll be ways that we can kind of keep the momentum going. All right. Save the tough one for the last one. Thank you, Joel. All right, great. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your session.